So today's topic is the development of the tongue and the thyroid gland, and it is related to the development of the tongue here. So I am explaining the thyroid gland in here. So we will see how the tongue is developing. The tongue develops in the oral cavity, as you know, in close relation to the pharyngeal arch 1, 2, 3, and 4. So these are the pharyngeal arch 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in relation of these structures, these pharyngeal arch, the tongue is developed during the 4th and 8th week of intrauterine life. We have seen that the pharyngeal arch arises as a mesodermal thickening in the lateral wall of the foregut, and it grows ventrally to become continuous with the corresponding arch of the opposite side to form the arch. So we will see here the most part of the first pharyngeal arch, that is a mandibular arch. So this is the most middle part of the first pharyngeal arch become thick. So the two swelling appears on the medial side of the mandibular arch, and these two swellings are known as the lingual swelling. And between the two lingual swelling, these two lingual swelling are separated partially by the another swelling that is known as the tuberculum impar. So we have three swellings here, two lingual swellings and another swelling that is known as the tuberculum impar. From these three swellings, the tongue arises. So we will see and here you have to see just behind the tuberculum impar we have this blue dot that is known as the foramen cecum. The foramen cecum is actually the remnant of the thyroglossal duct. At this site, the thyroglossal duct arises, which goes downwards. A diverticulum that grows downward from that duct, the thyroid gland arises. And when the remnant of that thyroglossal duct in the adult life is seen as a foramen cecum. Okay. So another swelling is seen just behind this tuberculum impar in relation to the third and fourth arch, that is known as the second. This midline swelling is due to the second, third, and fourth arch. This is known as the hypobrachial eminence. So we have the swellings, first swelling in relation to the first arch, that is two lingual swelling, and between two we have the tuberculum impar. Behind that we have the foramen cecum, from which the thyroglossal duct arises. Just behind this swelling in relation to the second, third, and fourth arch we have another midline swelling that is known as the hypobrachial eminence. What happens to this hypobrachial eminence, I will explain it later on. And just behind the hypobrachial eminence, in relation to the sixth arch, another thickening appears that is known as the tracheal groove. And you already know that the tracheal groove goes inside, dips into the epithelium and forms another diverticulum from which the respiratory system arises. That you already know. Now we have to explain this structure here. Now how the tongue is formed. We have the tongue. When we see the gross anatomy of the tongue, we divide the tongue into the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and the posterior most part of the tongue. When we see the gross anatomy of the tongue, so anterior 2/3 of the tongue is derived from these two swellings and tuberculum impar. As we know, some books write that tuberculum impar forming the tongue is controversial, but some books write that it also forms the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So we can say the anterior 2/3 of the tongue is developing from the two lingual swelling in relation to the first pharyngeal arch and by the tuberculum impar. And the posterior most of the tongue, here you can see in this picture. So these two lingual swellings join together and along with the tuberculum impar, forming the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and then we have the posterior most of the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Here you have to see one thing. As we know that in relation to the first arch, the two swellings arise. So the anterior 2/3 of the tongue is seen as arises from the first arch. So the blood nerve supply of the first anterior 2/3 of the tongue is the mandibular nerve. Okay. Then we see, and actually it has a as I already told you that the first arch has a two nerve supply. The one is the post-traumatic, that is the mandibular nerve, and the pre-traumatic, that is the chorda tympani, that carries the sensory supply from the anterior two-third of the tongue, that is the taste sensation. Now you have to see that in relation to the second, third and fourth, I told you we have the hypobrachial eminence. But what happens here in this picture, the third arch, it overgrows over the second arch. Now the third arch here you can see overgrows the second arch, and second arch gets buried under the third arch. So we can say the posterior one third of the tongue is derived from the third arch, because we have to see here the nerve supply of the posterior one third of the tongue is from the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is the nerve of the third arch. And the posterior most of the tongue that arises from the fourth arch, the nerve supply of this posterior most of the tongue is from the superior laryngeal nerve, which is the nerve of the fourth arch. So first anterior, so the anterior two-third of the tongue, which is derived from the mandibular nerve, have the two nerve supplies, one from the mandibular nerve, that is, and another from the chorda tympani. And then we have the third arch, because it overgrows a second arch, so a second arch does not have any nerve supply here. The third nerve of the third arch is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the posterior most of the tongue is derived from the fourth arch, so the nerve supply is the superior laryngeal nerve, which is the nerve of the fourth arch. This nerve supply of the tongue is very important. Usually you have asked about the nerve supply of the tongue. So anterior two-third of the tongue is supplied by the mandibular end and the chorda tympani, the posterior one third by the glossopharyngeal, and the posterior most by the superior laryngeal nerve of the vagus nerve. Okay, now we have the components of the tongue also. So here also you can see the anterior two-third of the tongue arises from the lingual nerve swellings, and this is tuberculum impar. We have the foramen cecum. So the foramen cecum is a demarcation between the anterior two-third and the posterior one-third. Okay. Then we can say, so we can say here we have the other components, like we have mucous membrane, we have the muscle, and we have the fibroareolar stroma. The mucosa of tongue is derived from the endoderm of the foregut. The muscles of the tongue is derived from the occipital myotome. That occipital myotome you already know from the paraxial mesoderm, you already know that. So the occipital myotome give rise to the muscle of the tongue. That is why the muscles of the tongue are, the nerve supply of the muscles are hypoglossal nerve, which is the nerve of this myotome. The fibroareolar tissue stroma is derived from the pharyngeal arch mesoderm. The epithelium of the tongue is first made of the single layer of cells